At a very early age, Charles Darwin showed great interest in um, nature. He was always collecting insects and bugs and trying to get out into nature, essentially. And his father, who was a physician, had pressured Charles Darwin to becoming a doctor. However, when Charles Darwin started studying medicine, he thought it was kind of boring and that it was kind of a little bit traumatic, um, seeing surgeries performed without anesthesia. You can imagine seeing an amputation without the person being sedated would probably be an important thing in your life and in trying to decide what career you wanted to follow. I'm sure for a lot of physicians at that day and age, seeing something like that would probably scare you out of medical school. So Darwin decided to become a priest, and as he was, becoming a priest, he was also learning about botany from his teacher. And so he was continuing this passion that he had for the natural world and for the environment, even though he was studying religion. At the same time of Darwin's graduation, there was a ship called the HMS Beagle in the British Navy that had been commissioned to travel around the coast of South America and basically map it. You remember that this is the middle of the 19th century by the time Darwin's going on this voyage, and South America has pretty much already been mapped. But you have to remember that they were always improving the level of detail in their maps, and so this ship was basically going around to look at the coastline. Now, the ship was a rather small ship, and the captain couldn't be seen fraternizing with the other sailors. The captain would always dine alone. And so you have to remember that in this time, being a captain aboard a ship was kind of a lonely job. And so before they set out on this voyage, the captain of the ship, Robert Fitzroy, was trying to find somebody who could accompany him and converse with him, eat dinner with him, basically be his buddy for the duration of the voyage. And it just so happened that he was in contact with Charles Darwin's professor, and one of the reverends at the school where he was going to. And so it ended up being that Charles Darwin went on the HMS Beagle to basically keep company for the captain. So as Darwin was traveling around South America, he made a few observations about the type of wildlife that he saw. And one observation that he made was that organisms have adaptations that help them survive under a specific set of circumstances and environmental conditions. So for example, penguins in Argentina had feathers that helped them swim in the ocean. A second observation that he made was that organisms that are close to each other tend to look more similar than organisms that are separated by vast distances and oceans. So what that means is, for example, birds in South America look like other birds in South America. They don't look like birds in North America. And this extended into the fossil record as well, which Darwin was very keen to look at because he was, during the voyage, reading Charles Lyell's books on things like uniformitarianism. And so what he found in the fossil record as well was that organisms that are in a certain location have certain adaptations that are different from the organisms in the fossil record of Europe, which had entirely different adaptations. The third observation that Darwin made was in reference to the Galapagos Islands, uh, where on this collection of islands off the coast of Ecuador, he found a number of organisms which were very, very similar to each other, but had tiny modifications or adaptations which uh, made him think that in fact they were different species. And indeed, some of the species that he found on the Galapagos Islands were unique to those islands and could be found nowhere else on Earth. And he didn't quite fully grasp the meaning behind all of these observations that he had made during his voyage until he returned back to England, and that's where he started to come up with his theory of evolution. Now, Darwin had left on his voyage with the Beagle in 1831, and he never decided to publish his works all the way until 1858. So between 1831 and 1858, that's 27 years. During that time period, Darwin was still a very proficient scientist. He was writing articles about fishes and even earthworms. He wrote a paper about earthworms in Great Britain, which I'm sure you would all just be dying to read. Now, as he was doing his work as a naturalist, he was also focusing on his religious studies. And there's a lot of historians who think that his religious leanings, his religious background, influenced the delay in publishing of his work. Some think that, he was very afraid for what his theory could mean to the religious establishment, and especially to ideas related to creationism and the creationism stories. Eventually, though, Darwin had to publish his results because there was another scientist named Alfred Russel Wallace who was located in Indonesia at the time, who had sent a paper to Charles Darwin so that he could look through it. Remember that Darwin was publishing a lot of articles at this time, and would have been somebody who was good to look over, a profound piece of work before you published it, to make sure that you didn't say anything stupid or anything that didn't make any sense. And so Wallace had sent his paper for review to Charles Darwin prior to publishing, and Darwin realized after reading his paper that Wallace had come up with the exact same ideas independently of Charles Darwin. And so Darwin was a little bit worried that this guy was going to get all of the credit. And so that caused Darwin to, rush the rest of his book and make sure that it was going to be published as soon as possible. Now, Wallace's paper was published before Charles Darwin's book was published. So the question is, why does Wallace not get the credit and Charles Darwin gets all of the credit? It's because Wallace had only published a single paper, whereas Charles Darwin published an entire book. And so the weight of explanation and the logical thought process and the evidence that Charles Darwin supplied far outweighed Wallace's. And in fact, during this time period, Wallace even wanted Darwin to get the credit, because for him it was obvious that Darwin had come up with his idea first, and just the amount of explanation that he had provided in his book was far more than what Wallace had done. So that's why Charles Darwin gets all the credit, and you've never ever heard of Alfred Russel Wallace.